Putin wants to use winter to change three things in Ukrainians' minds. The first mental shift he wants is perhaps the most Orwellian. He wants them to start thinking of war as weather. Humans know the difference between being hemmed in by a storm and being hemmed in by an enemy. Rousseau put it like this: if I am prevented from leaving my house by a snowstorm, I am not less free for that. But if I am prevented by another person, then I am not free. Putin's winter campaign wants to erase this distinction so that Ukrainians experience the cold not as an attack, but as something inevitable and elemental, like a natural disaster, not like an attack by the Kremlin. Why? Because if violence becomes weather, your sense of causality breaks down and your anger decenters away from the aggressor. Ukrainian anger loses the Kremlin as its target. Screaming at the Kremlin becomes like screaming at a hurricane, so instead you scream at your own government. Why weren't we ready? Why is our heat still off? Why is the state failing us? Why is our local government useless? We can already see this happening a little bit. Ukrainians have argued among themselves. Zelensky has accused the Kiev authorities of not being well prepared. And the Kiev authorities have accused Zelensky of speaking rot. Putin likes this because it turns a war of national survival into a municipal dispute about utility management. The second mental shift Putin wants is the heaviest of the three. It is a shift where endurance begins to feel like futility. In the early days of the war, endurance was defiance. Putin was surprised about this because he is ignorant about Ukraine. He resented the social cohesion Ukraine showed in 2022 because for Putin, Ukrainian strength ultimately must be fake, because you can't have strength if you're not a real country. Whatever social cohesion you have must be a product of Western stagecraft and malign Western propaganda. Having got this badly wrong, Putin is now playing with thresholds. He's gambling that if he applies enough pressure, Ukraine's fake cohesion will eventually shatter, because cold accelerates political time. It's year 5 of the full-scale war. You sit in the cold, in the dark. Your pipes have cracked. They might not be fixed for another year. You're worried about the vulnerability of your young, your sick, and your elderly. And then a thought comes up. Maybe Ukraine cannot outlast Russia. And if that's true, then my resistance only prolongs everybody's suffering. Putin wants Ukrainians to move from how do we resist to why are we resisting at all, and is it even ethical to resist? And you begin to ask, is holding on selfish? If I can endure, is it ethical to drag my neighbor into this? Isn't it more humane to say, let's end this on any terms? And is dignity and freedom really worth all this suffering? This is a moral inversion. The victim begins to feel responsible for being attacked, responsible for the violence inflicted upon them. Of course, it's a legitimate question to ask when to stop and when to compromise. But it has to be a Ukrainian question, answered by Ukrainians, and not a Kremlin-instigated winter psyop. The third mental shift Putin wants is the most dangerous. It's the conviction that the West has abandoned Ukraine. Here, Putin can use Trump as a psychological weapon. He can say to the Ukrainian people, look, Trump has assisted me with my campaign against your energy system for a year simply by letting me get on with it while talking about peace. Let's take the example of the so-called energy ceasefire. Trump claimed he called Putin and asked for a week-long pause. He sold this to the world as a diplomatic victory. I called Vladimir very strongly, and he said yes because he wants to stop the war. But this is post-truth PR. It's a cover for Putin, and it's a cover for Trump's fantasies about how he can stop the war. The Russian assault on Ukraine's energy system proceeds in waves. Since October 2025, these waves have roughly happened 5 times a month. Between one massive wave and the next, a week passes anyway. So what's a ceasefire in Trump's post-truth world is a breather in military reality. This helps Putin tell Ukrainians, look, your allies are complicit in this. Putin wants Ukrainians to feel when they look west that they're getting a round of applause, but no proper backing. So what are the consequences of this for Ukraine? What does it tell us about Putin's mind? And what's the key lesson for us in the West? The consequences in Ukraine are that Putin is still trying, but he hasn't yet succeeded. Take this with a pinch of salt, as we must take polls at wartime, but according to the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, at the end of January 2026, 53% of those asked said it was absolutely unacceptable to cede the remainder of the Donetsk Oblast to Russia. 40% were ready to accept this, but only in return for security guarantees from the US. Meanwhile, 65% of those asked said they were ready to endure the war as long as necessary. And that number is higher, not lower, than it was in 2024 and 2023. This is not surprising, and it should not be surprising to the tyrant in the Kremlin, but here is an interesting fact. Putin's older brother Viktor died as a toddler in the siege of Leningrad. In December 1941, heating was turned off in the city. Temperatures fell to -30 Celsius. Pipes froze and burst. The water supply stopped. Cold and hunger and fear of cold and hunger were worse than the fear of the explosive metal falling from the sky, whistling before it struck. Disease proliferated. Humans turned animal-like to survive. And Putin's answer to all of this is goody. I'll do one of my own, a version light. There are two ways to respond to horrors visited on your people. One way to respond is to say, we suffered and we must not let this happen again. Another is to say, I will control the conditions of terror. Instead of never again, I will be the one who decides who freezes. It's possible that Putin's understanding of the siege comes from Soviet propaganda rather than the extraordinary accounts of survivors. But that would only make Putin's era worse, because the propaganda version invented a fake renaissance of unity and loyalty in the face of adversity. In reality, Leningrad shows that winter sieges are double-edged. They can bring people together and they can tear people apart. Putin is trying to weaponize the tearing apart, but he's underestimating the unity. The lesson for us in the West is that when this happens to you, you refuse moral inversion. It's a win for the aggressor if you can make the victim feel responsible for being attacked. This doesn't just happen in war. We can look at the recent ICE campaign on the streets of the United States. It was Hannah Arendt's view, drawing on Heidegger's critique of technological modernity, that totalitarianism mobilizes terror and drama to decenter a citizen's sense of reality. When the political entrepreneur J.D. Vance says that black is white and white is black, the message is that the victim is the aggressor and truth only holds until it collides with power. We've traced how Ukrainians are being pushed by Putin to see resistance as futile. That pressure is riding on Soviet propaganda and the memory of Ukraine and Russia being part of the same country. To understand how Soviet nostalgia still fools millions today, watch this video next.